The morning sun cast long shadows across the Nevada Desert Training Facility as Lieutenant Sarah Chen adjusted her rifle scope for the third time. The heat was already rising from the sand, creating those familiar waves that made distant targets dance like mirages. She had been the only woman in her sniper class at Fort Benning, graduating second in her group of 43 soldiers. Now, 2 years later, she found herself at the most elite training facility in the country, surrounded by Navy SEALs who looked at her like she was a tourist who had wandered into the wrong neighborhood. Commander Jake Morrison stood 30 yards behind her, his arms crossed over his chest as he watched her methodical preparation. At 38, Morrison had led more covert operations than most soldiers would see in 3 careers. His weathered face bore the kind of confidence that came from never being wrong about anything that mattered. The other 13 SEALs in his unit lounged in whatever shade they could find, some cleaning their weapons, others just watching the show with barely concealed amusement. "You sure about this, Chen?" Morrison called out, his voice carrying easily across the desert air. "These aren't paper targets at summer camp. We're talking about precision shooting under combat conditions." Sarah didn't turn around, but her jaw tightened slightly. She had heard variations of this speech from every male instructor she had ever worked with. The targets were arranged at various distances from 300 yards out to nearly 800 yards, each one representing a different tactical scenario. Some were partially concealed behind barriers, others elevated on platforms, and a few were designed to simulate moving targets with mechanical systems that would shift them unpredictably. "I understand the parameters, sir," she replied, her voice steady despite the weight of 14 pairs of eyes boring into her back. The rifle felt familiar in her hands, like an extension of herself. She had spent countless hours with this particular weapon, learning its quirks and tendencies until she could predict exactly where each round would go based on wind, temperature, and humidity. Morrison shook his head and looked at his men. Sergeant First Class Mike Torres, his second-in-command, was grinning like someone had just told him his favorite joke. Torres had been with Morrison for 8 years and had never seen their commander's assessment of someone proven wrong. If Morrison said someone couldn't handle the pressure, they folded. It was that simple. "Look, I get it," Morrison continued, walking closer to where Sarah lay prone behind her rifle. "You've got impressive scores on paper. Your instructors wrote glowing reports. But there's a difference between hitting targets when you know exactly what to expect and performing when lives depend on it." The desert wind picked up slightly, and Sarah automatically adjusted her position to compensate. She had been studying the wind patterns for the past 20 minutes, noting how the heat thermals affected bullet trajectory at different distances. Most shooters would rely on their spotters for this information, but Sarah had trained herself to read environmental conditions independently. "The thing is," Morrison said, his voice taking on a more serious tone, "when we're downrange, there's no room for hesitation. No second chances. My men need to know that whoever's providing overwatch can deliver when it counts. And frankly, I've never seen a female sniper who could handle that kind of pressure." One of the SEALs, a lean man named Rodriguez, chuckled quietly. "Come on, Commander. At least let her try. Might be educational." Sarah finally turned her head to look at Morrison directly. Her dark eyes held no anger, just a quiet determination that made Morrison pause for a moment. "With respect, sir, I didn't ask to be here to prove anything about female snipers. I'm here because someone thought my skills might be useful to your team. Whether you believe that or not doesn't change what I can do." Morrison studied her face, looking for signs of doubt or defensive anger that he was used to seeing when people were challenged. Instead, he saw something that reminded him uncomfortably of his own expression when someone questioned his abilities. "Fair enough," he said finally. 14 targets, various distances and conditions. You call your shots, no spotter assistance. Think you can handle that?" "Yes, sir. And if you miss more than 2? Sarah turned back to her rifle, settling into her shooting position with fluid precision. "I won't." The confidence in her voice wasn't boastful or loud. It was the quiet certainty of someone who had done something so many times that failure wasn't even a consideration. Morrison felt something shift in his chest, a tiny crack in his absolute certainty about how this demonstration would end. Torres stepped up beside his commander. "Want me to call the shots for scoring?" Morrison nodded, but his eyes never left Sarah's form. The way she positioned herself behind the rifle was textbook perfect, but there was something more. She moved with the kind of unconscious competence that only came from thousands of hours of practice. Every adjustment she made seemed to flow naturally from the last, as if she and the weapon were connected by something deeper than training. "Whenever you're ready." "Chen," Morrison called out. Sarah took a deep breath, let half of it out, and began to squeeze the trigger. The desert seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see whether the SEAL commander's legendary judgment would hold true, or if they were about to witness something that would change everything they thought they knew about precision shooting. The crack of Sarah's rifle echoed across the desert like thunder, sharp and clean in the dry air. Through her scope, she watched the first target jerk backward as the bullet found its center. 300 yards, dead center mass. She didn't pause to celebrate or even acknowledge the hit. Her breathing remained steady as she shifted slightly to acquire the second target. Morrison pulled up his binoculars, scanning the distant target array. The first target showed a clean hole exactly where it should be. His expression remained neutral, but Torres noticed the slight tightening around his commander's eyes. One shot meant nothing. Lucky shots happened all the time, especially at shorter ranges. The second shot came 15 seconds later. Another crack, another immediate impact. This target was positioned at 450 yards, partially concealed behind a concrete barrier designed to simulate urban combat conditions. Sarah had to thread the needle through a gap barely wider than a basketball. The bullet passed through the opening and struck the target's upper chest area with mechanical precision. 2 for 2, Torres murmured, lowering his own binoculars. Several of the other SEALs had stopped their casual conversations and were now paying closer attention. Sarah's third target presented the first real challenge of the course. At 620 yards, it was mounted on a system that moved it laterally across a 6-foot span every 12 seconds. She had been timing the movement pattern while shooting the stationary targets, calculating the precise moment when the target would be in the optimal position. Most shooters would wait for the target to stop or reach the end of its travel. Sarah fired while it was moving. The bullet caught the target dead center as it crossed the midpoint of its arc. The mechanical precision required to hit a moving target at that distance with a crosswind was something that separated professional snipers from recreational shooters. Morrison's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Damn," someone whispered behind him. Target 4 was at maximum range, 785 yards. At this distance, environmental factors became crucial. Temperature, humidity, wind speed, and even the rotation of the Earth could affect bullet trajectory. The target itself was smaller than the others, designed to simulate a precision shot on a specific threat rather than general combat engagement. Sarah had been calculating the ballistics in her head throughout the exercise. She made a small adjustment to her scope, compensating for the slight crosswind that had picked up in the last few minutes. Her breathing slowed even further as she entered what instructors called the zone, that mental state where external distractions disappeared, and the world narrowed down to crosshairs and target. The shot seemed to hang in the air forever. At nearly 800 yards, there was a noticeable delay between the rifle's report and the bullet's impact. When it finally hit, the target spun backward with authority. Another perfect center hit. Morrison lowered his binoculars and looked at Torres, who was shaking his head in disbelief. 4 for 4 at varying ranges, Torres said quietly. "Including a mover at 620. "I can count," Morrison replied, but his voice lacked its earlier confidence. The fifth target required Sarah to engage from a different position entirely. She smoothly transitioned from prone to a supported kneeling position behind a concrete barrier, simulating the kind of awkward shooting stance that field conditions often demanded. The target was at 520 yards, but positioned at a severe angle that required her to calculate trajectory through 3 dimensions rather than 2. She took 30 seconds to settle into the new position, finding her natural point of aim and ensuring her sight picture was perfect. The rifle cracked again, and the distant target jerked as another round found its mark. 5, Torres announced, though by now everyone was counting. The 6th target was perhaps the most challenging yet, a small silhouette at 680 yards that was only partially visible behind cover. Only the upper portion of the target's head was exposed, presenting a shooting zone roughly the size of a dinner plate at that distance. It was the kind of shot that required absolute precision, with no margin for error. Sarah studied the target through her scope for nearly a minute, reading wind indicators and calculating the exact hold-off required. The desert had gone completely quiet except for the whisper of wind across sand. Even the SEALs had stopped their casual chatter, watching in fascination as this lone woman methodically dismantled targets that would challenge their best marksmen. When she finally fired, the target's head section disintegrated in a cloud of fragments. The bullet had struck exactly where the neck would be on a human silhouette. Morrison felt something cold settle in his stomach. This wasn't luck or favorable conditions. This was skill at a level he had rarely seen, even among his own carefully selected team members. The woman behind that rifle was demonstrating the kind of precision shooting that could change the outcome of entire operations. 6, Torres said, and his voice carried a note of respect that hadn't been there 20 minutes earlier. Sarah shifted position again for target 7, moving to an elevated platform that simulated shooting from a rooftop or upper story window. The target was at 590 yards, positioned to require a steep downward angle that would affect bullet trajectory in ways that could fool inexperienced shooters. As she settled into position, Morrison found himself studying her technique with professional interest rather than skeptical oversight. Every movement was economical and purposeful. She wasted no motion, displayed no nervous energy, and showed no signs of being affected by the pressure of performing in front of hostile observers. The 7th shot was as clean as the previous 6. The bullet struck the target's center mass with enough force to knock it completely off its mounting post. Morrison looked around at his men and saw his own surprise reflected in their faces. 7 perfect shots under varying conditions, at ranges and angles that would challenge veteran snipers, and she had made it look routine. 7 for 7, Torres announced unnecessarily. Every man present had watched the impossible become inevitable with each successive shot. Half the course remained, and Sarah showed no signs of fatigue or pressure. If anything, she seemed to be settling into a rhythm that suggested the targets were becoming easier rather than harder. Morrison realized with growing unease that his absolute certainty about the demonstration's outcome was crumbling with each rifle crack that echoed across the Nevada desert. Target 8 required Sarah to move to ground level and engage from behind a vehicle, using the hood as a shooting rest while simulating cover behind automotive concealment. The target sat at 440 yards, but was positioned so that only intermittent glimpses were possible through a series of vertical barriers designed to mimic urban environments where clear sight lines were rare. She dropped prone behind the vehicle's front end, using the engine block as both cover and a stable shooting platform. The metal was already hot from the desert sun, but she positioned her rifle carefully to avoid contact with the heated surface. Through her scope, she could see brief windows of opportunity as the target became visible between the barriers. Morrison watched her settle into position with growing fascination. The casual dismissiveness he had felt earlier was being replaced by something approaching professional admiration. This wasn't some academy graduate trying to prove herself. This was a craftsperson demonstrating mastery of her trade. Sarah waited patiently for the right moment. Lesser shooters would have rushed the shot, afraid of losing the brief window of opportunity. She let 2 potential shots pass while she refined her sight picture and confirmed her hold. When she finally fired, the bullet passed cleanly between 2 barriers and struck the target center mass. 8, Torres called out, though his announcement was barely audible above the murmurs from the other SEALs. The 9th target presented a new challenge: extreme angle shooting. Positioned on a tower 380 yards away, but 60 feet above her position, it required calculating trajectory through a steep upward angle, while compensating for how gravity would affect the bullet's path differently than on horizontal shots. Sarah transitioned to a sitting position, using her knees as a stable shooting platform, while bracing her back against a concrete wall. The position looked uncomfortable to the observers, but it provided the elevation and stability needed for the shot. She took extra time with this target, running calculations in her head that most shooters would need a ballistic computer to figure out. The shot arced upward through the clear desert air, seeming to defy gravity for a moment before finding its target. The impact was visible even at that distance, a small puff of dust and debris marking another perfect hit. Morrison found himself studying Sarah's face between shots, looking for signs of stress or concentration that would indicate she was being pushed to her limits. Instead, he saw the same calm focus that he recognized in his most experienced operators. She wasn't fighting the course. She was flowing through it like water finding its natural path. Target 10 was back at ground level but placed at the maximum effective range for her weapon system, 800 yards in challenging conditions. The desert wind had picked up considerably, and heat thermals were creating visible distortions that would throw off most shooters' calculations. The target itself was partially concealed and presented only a narrow silhouette. Sarah spent nearly 2 minutes studying the conditions before taking the shot. She watched grass moving in the distance to judge wind speed, observed the heat waves rising from sun-baked rocks to calculate thermal effects, and even waited for a cloud to pass over the sun to eliminate glare from her scope lens. When she finally fired, the shot seemed to hang in the air forever. At maximum range with challenging conditions, even a perfect shot could be affected by factors beyond the shooter's control. The bullet struck the target's upper chest area with enough force to spin it completely around its mounting post. 10 for 10, Torres announced, and his voice carried undisguised amazement. Morrison looked around at his team and saw something he had never witnessed before. Navy SEALs looking genuinely impressed by someone they had initially dismissed. Rodriguez was shaking his head in disbelief. Williams was studying Sarah through binoculars as if trying to figure out how she was doing what seemed impossible. Even the normally stoic Jackson was leaning forward with obvious interest. Target 11 required another position change, this time to an elevated platform that simulated shooting from a helicopter or aircraft. The target was at 550 yards but moving on an irregular pattern designed to simulate a fleeing vehicle or individual. The platform itself swayed slightly in the wind, adding another variable to an already complex shot. Sarah climbed to the platform with smooth efficiency, never wasting movement or energy. She settled into a modified prone position that compensated for the platform's movement while maintaining sight picture on the target below. The mechanical precision with which she tracked the moving target through her scope was mesmerizing to watch. She led the target perfectly, firing at the exact moment when her calculations indicated the bullet and target would intersect. The impact occurred exactly as predicted, with the bullet catching the moving target at the center of its travel path. 11, Torres said, and Morrison realized his second-in-command was no longer bothering to hide his admiration. Target 12 was positioned to test Sarah's ability to engage multiple threats in sequence. 2 targets were placed at different ranges, one at 420 yards, another at 630 yards, and she had to engage both within a 30-second window to simulate neutralizing multiple hostiles before they could respond to the first shot. She acquired the closer target first, firing within seconds of settling into position. The bullet struck home with her characteristic precision. Without pausing to admire the shot, she smoothly transitioned to the second target, adjusting her scope and recalculating hold-off for the greater distance. The second shot came 18 seconds after the first, well within the time limit, and was equally accurate. 12 and 13, Torres announced. 2 for 2 in rapid succession. Morrison felt his worldview shifting in ways he wasn't entirely comfortable with. Everything he thought he knew about performance under pressure, about the differences between training and real-world application, was being systematically dismantled by a woman who made impossible shots look routine. Only one target remained, and Morrison found himself hoping against hope that she would miss. Not because he wanted her to fail, but because her success was forcing him to confront assumptions he had carried for his entire career. If she could do this, if she could perform at this level under observation and pressure, then what other assumptions had he made that were equally wrong? Target 14 sat at 720 yards, partially concealed, elevated, and positioned to require the most difficult shot of the entire course. It was the kind of target that his best snipers would be satisfied to hit 3 times out of 5 attempts. Sarah studied it through her scope with the same methodical patience she had shown for the previous 13 targets, seemingly unaware that she was one shot away from achieving something that Morrison would have sworn was impossible 30 minutes earlier. The final target seemed to mock them all from its perch 720 yards away. Positioned on an angled platform behind partial concealment, it presented the smallest visible area of any target on the course. The afternoon sun had shifted enough to create challenging shadows and glare conditions that would force even experienced shooters to work harder to acquire a clear sight picture. Sarah took her time studying every aspect of the shot. She observed wind indicators at multiple distances, noting how the breeze patterns changed as air currents moved around natural and artificial obstacles. The heat thermals were more pronounced now as the day grew warmer. creating visible distortions that could throw off her calculations by several inches at that range. Morrison found himself unconsciously holding his breath as he watched her prepare. 13 perfect shots had shattered his preconceptions so completely that he almost didn't recognize his own thoughts anymore. The woman behind that rifle had demonstrated a level of skill that belonged in the upper echelon of special operations snipers, not in some experimental training program. Torres lowered his binoculars and looked at his commander. "Sir, regardless of what happens with this last shot, we need to talk about integration protocols." Morrison nodded absently, his attention fixed on Sarah's methodical preparation. She had adjusted her position 3 times, seeking the perfect angle that would give her the clearest view through the target's concealment while maintaining optimal stability for the shot. Each adjustment was small but purposeful, the kind of attention to detail that separated professionals from amateurs. The other SEALs had gathered closer now, abandoning any pretense of casual disinterest. Williams was timing her preparation with his watch, noting how she took exactly the right amount of time for each calculation without rushing or overthinking. Rodriguez was studying her shooting form through binoculars, looking for technical details he could incorporate into his own marksmanship training. Jackson, the team's designated marksman, was perhaps the most impressed of all. He had fired this exact course 6 months earlier and managed 11 hits out of 14 attempts, a score that Morrison had praised as exceptional. Watching Sarah work, he began to understand the difference between being very good at something and being truly masterful. Sarah made one final adjustment to her scope, compensating for a slight wind shift that had occurred in the last 30 seconds. Through her optics, the target appeared to waver slightly in the heat thermals, but she had learned to read these distortions and calculate how they would affect her bullet's path. The visible portion of the target was roughly the size of a coffee cup at that distance. With no room for error, her breathing slowed to the deep, controlled rhythm that marked a sniper's final preparation sequence. Everything else faded away. The watching men, the desert heat, the pressure of performing under scrutiny. The world narrowed down to crosshairs, target, and the precise moment when all variables aligned. Morrison watched her finger begin the final trigger, squeeze, and realized he was witnessing something that would change how he evaluated every shooter who came after her. 13 consecutive hits at varying ranges and conditions wasn't luck or favorable circumstances. It was skill at a level that demanded respect regardless of gender, branch of service, or any other factor he might have considered relevant an hour earlier. The rifle cracked for the 14th time, and Morrison found himself tracking the bullet's path through his binoculars with an intensity that surprised him. At maximum range with challenging conditions, even a perfect shot could be affected by variables beyond any shooter's control. Wind gusts, temperature changes, or equipment variations could turn a perfect aim point into a near miss. The bullet seemed to hang in the desert air forever before finding its target. When it struck, the impact was clearly visible even at that distance, a solid hit in the center of the target's visible area. The target spun backward off its mounting post and clattered to the ground in a cloud of dust and debris. Complete silence fell over the group. Even the desert wind seemed to pause as if acknowledging what they had all witnessed. 14 shots, 14 hits under conditions that would challenge the military's best marksman. Sarah had not just passed Morrison's test. She had redefined what he thought was possible. Torres was the first to speak. 14 for 14. Perfect score on the advanced precision course. Sarah remained in position for a moment longer, following through on her final shot with the same methodical precision she had shown throughout the demonstration. When she finally rose from behind her rifle, her expression was calm and professional. No celebration, no acknowledgement of having done something extraordinary. Just the quiet satisfaction of completing a job exactly as it should be done. Morrison walked forward, his mind racing to process what he had witnessed. His absolute certainty about female shooters under pressure had been completely shattered in less than an hour. Everything he thought he knew about performance standards and capability assessments needed to be reconsidered. That was, he began, then stopped, realizing he didn't have words for what he had just seen. Sarah looked at him directly, her dark eyes showing neither pride nor defensiveness. "Adequate, sir?" Morrison almost smiled at her choice of words. Adequate. 14 consecutive hits at maximum effective range under challenging conditions, and she called it adequate. The complete absence of ego in her response told him as much about her character as her shooting had revealed about her skills. "Where did you train?" he asked, his voice carrying genuine curiosity rather than the skeptical challenge of an hour earlier. "Same places as most snipers, sir. Fort Benning. Specialized courses at Quantico. Some time with British instructors at Hereford." She paused, seeming to consider her next words carefully. "The difference might be that I never assumed I was good enough. I kept training." Torres stepped up beside Morrison, shaking his head in amazement. 14 for 14 on the advanced course. "I've seen maybe 3 shooters manage that, and they were all what?" Morrison interrupted, realizing where that sentence was heading. Torres looked embarrassed. "All career snipers with 15+ years of experience, sir." Morrison looked back at Sarah, noting how she had already begun the methodical process of cleaning and securing her weapon. No grandstanding, no waiting for praise, just professional competence at a level that commanded respect from anyone qualified to recognize it. He realized that his assumptions hadn't just been wrong. They had been so far from reality that he felt almost embarrassed by his earlier certainty. The walk back to the main facility occurred in unusual silence. Morrison's team, normally quick with commentary and analysis after any training exercise, seemed lost in their own thoughts. The demonstration they had just witnessed challenged fundamental assumptions that most of them had carried throughout their military careers. Rodriguez finally broke the silence. "Commander, I've been doing this for 12 years and I've never seen shooting like that. Not from anyone." Morrison glanced at Sarah, who was walking slightly ahead of the group, her rifle case slung across her shoulder with practiced ease. She seemed completely unaffected by the attention, moving with the same quiet confidence she had displayed throughout the shooting demonstration. "The conditions weren't exactly ideal," Williams added, wiping sweat from his forehead. "That crosswind in the last half hour would have thrown off most shooters by at least a few inches at long range." Jackson, who had been uncharacteristically quiet since the demonstration ended, stopped walking and turned to face the group. "You want to know what impressed me most? It wasn't the accuracy, though that was incredible. It was how she read conditions. I watched her adjust for wind changes that I didn't even notice until after she compensated for them." Sarah continued walking, apparently unbothered by becoming the subject of their analysis. Morrison found himself studying her reaction, or rather, her lack of reaction. Most soldiers would have been either defensive about the scrutiny or basking in the praise. She seemed genuinely indifferent to both possibilities. When they reached the facility's main building, Morrison gestured toward a conference room. "Chen, I'd like to debrief for a few minutes." "Of course, sir." The conference room was spartanly furnished with a metal table and chairs, maps of various overseas locations covering the walls. Sarah took a seat across from Morrison, her posture relaxed but attentive. Torres and Jackson joined them, while the rest of the team dispersed to other duties. Morrison studied her face, looking for signs of smugness or satisfaction that he was accustomed to seeing from soldiers who had just proven their critics wrong. Instead, he saw the same calm professionalism she had displayed throughout the demonstration. "I owe you an apology," he said finally. "My assessment of your capabilities was based on assumptions rather than evidence." Sarah nodded acknowledgement but didn't respond immediately. When she spoke, her voice was measured and thoughtful. "Respectfully, sir, your assumptions weren't unreasonable given your experience. You've probably never worked with a female sniper who performed at the level your missions require." "That's true," Morrison admitted, "but it doesn't excuse prejudging your abilities." Torres leaned forward in his chair. "What I don't understand is how you developed that level of skill. The kind of precision shooting we saw today usually takes years of specialized training and extensive field experience." Sarah considered the question carefully before answering. "I think it started with motivation, sir. I knew from the beginning that I would be held to different standards. Not officially, but in practice. Every instructor, every evaluation, every assignment, I had to be not just as good as my male counterparts, but noticeably better." She paused, looking out the window at the desert landscape where she had just shattered 14 targets with mechanical precision. "So I trained harder, spent more time on the range, studied ballistics and environmental factors more thoroughly, sought out additional instruction whenever possible." Jackson nodded slowly. "That explains the technical knowledge, but not the performance under pressure. What we saw today, That was combat-level stress management. I've had plenty of practice with people expecting me to fail, Sarah replied with what might have been a slight smile. Today wasn't particularly stressful compared to some evaluations I've been through. Morrison felt another piece of his worldview shift. He had assumed that the pressure of performing in front of skeptical SEALs would be overwhelming for someone trying to prove themselves. Instead, it seemed like Sarah had faced more challenging circumstances during her regular training and evaluation process. "Tell me about your deployment experience," Morrison said. 2 tours in Afghanistan, 1 in Iraq. Primarily overwatch and reconnaissance missions, 47 confirmed targets at ranges from 200 to 820 meters. Her voice remained matter-of-fact, as if she were reciting equipment specifications rather than describing combat engagements. Torres whistled softly. 47 confirmed kills? What unit were you with? Sarah provided the details of her assignments, and Morrison found himself reassessing everything he thought he knew about this demonstration. This wasn't some academy graduate trying to prove theoretical skills in practical application. This was a combat veteran with extensive field experience who had already proven her capabilities in the most demanding environment possible. "Why didn't this information come up in your file review?" Morrison asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "Because it wasn't considered relevant to your assessment, sir. The briefing materials focused on training scores and marksmanship qualifications, not deployment history." Morrison realized with growing embarrassment that his preconceptions had prevented him from reviewing Sarah's complete record. He had seen female sniper trainee and made assumptions that caused him to focus only on information that seemed to confirm his expectations. Jackson was studying Sarah with obvious professional interest. 47 confirmed targets. What was your longest successful engagement? 820 meters. Moving target in crosswind conditions, similar to Target 11 on today's course, but with additional complications from urban, environment, and time constraints. The casual way she described what was obviously an extremely challenging combat shot made Morrison realized that today's demonstration probably hadn't been particularly difficult for her. She had been operating well within her established capabilities rather than pushing her limits. "The question now," Torres said, looking at Morrison, "is how we integrate this capability into our operational planning." Morrison nodded, his mind already shifting from assessment mode to tactical consideration. "What kind of support structure are you used to working with? Do you typically operate independently or as part of a sniper team?" "Both, sir. I'm qualified as either a sniper or spotter, and I've worked in various team configurations depending on mission requirements." The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, covering technical details, equipment preferences, and operational experience. With each answer, Morrison gained a clearer picture of someone whose capabilities far exceeded what he had expected to evaluate. When the debrief concluded, Morrison walked Sarah to her temporary quarters, his mind still processing the afternoon's revelations. Everything he thought he knew about precision shooting, performance under pressure, and gender-based capability assumptions had been systematically dismantled in less than 2 hours. "Chen," he said as they reached her door, "I want you to know that what happened today, both your performance and my initial assessment, has given me a lot to think about." Sarah nodded respectfully. "Thank you for the opportunity to demonstrate my capabilities, sir. I know it wasn't what you expected." That, Morrison thought as he walked back toward the main facility, was the understatement of his military career. 3 days later, Morrison found himself in his office reviewing operational reports when Torres knocked on his doorframe. The sergeant's expression carried the kind of serious concern that usually preceded difficult conversations. "Come in," Morrison said, gesturing to the chair across from his desk. "What's on your mind?" Torres settled into the chair and pulled out a tablet displaying message traffic from higher headquarters. "We got a priority tasking, sir. High-value target in Yemen. Intelligence indicates a weapons dealer who's been supplying advanced munitions to terrorist groups throughout the region." Morrison accepted the tablet and scrolled through the operational summary. The target was holed up in a compound surrounded by civilian structures, making conventional assault options problematic. The mission would require precision elimination, from extended range to minimize collateral damage and avoid civilian casualties. Optimal shooting position is from a ridgeline 650 meters from the target building, Torres continued. Clean sight lines but challenging conditions. high winds, temperature variations, and a narrow window for engagement based on the target's movement patterns. Morrison studied the reconnaissance photos and topographical data. The mission parameters were exactly the kind of challenge that required exceptional marksmanship skills. Under normal circumstances, he would assign Jackson to the overwatch position without hesitation. Jackson was competent, experienced, and reliable under pressure. But the events of 3 days earlier had fundamentally changed Morrison's understanding of competence and reliability. Sarah's demonstration had not just proven her individual capabilities, it had forced him to recognize how his assumptions had been limiting his operational options. "What's your recommendation for personnel assignment?" Morrison asked, though he suspected he already knew what Torres would suggest. "Honestly, sir, after what we saw on Tuesday, I think we should consider Chen for the overwatch position. The shot parameters are well within her demonstrated capabilities, and her deployment experience indicates she can handle the operational stress." Morrison set down the tablet and looked out his office window, toward the training ranges where Sarah was currently conducting advanced marksmanship instruction for junior personnel. Reports from those sessions indicated that she was not only an exceptional shooter, but also an effective instructor, sharing technical knowledge and training methods that were improving performance across the unit. "Jackson won't like being passed over for a high-profile mission," Morrison observed. "Jackson's a professional. He'll understand if the decision is based on operational requirements rather than personal preference." Torres paused, choosing his next words carefully. "Sir, I've been thinking about what happened during that demonstration. We pride ourselves on selecting the best personnel for each mission based on capabilities, not politics or personal feelings." Morrison nodded slowly. The principle Torres was referencing had been fundamental to their unit's success for years. Every assignment was supposed to be merit-based, with mission success taking priority over individual egos or organizational comfort zones. "There's something else," Torres continued. "I talked to Williams about the ballistic calculations Chen was running during her demonstration. He's been analyzing the environmental conditions we recorded that day, and some of her compensations were more advanced than what we typically see from field snipers." Morrison raised an eyebrow. Williams held advanced degrees in physics and engineering, serving as the team's technical specialist when missions required complex calculations or equipment modifications. His opinion on ballistic science carried considerable weight. "What kind of compensations?" She was adjusting for Coriolis effect on shots over 600 meters. "Most snipers ignore that factor unless they're shooting at extreme ranges over 1,000 meters. She was also compensating for barrel heating effects between shots, which requires understanding how metal expansion affects bullet velocity." Morrison felt another piece of his assessment framework shift. These weren't just marksmanship skills. They were indicators of someone who understood the science behind precision shooting at a level that most operators never reached. A knock on the office door interrupted their conversation. Jackson appeared in the doorway, his expression serious but controlled. "Sir, Torres said you wanted to see me about the Yemen mission." "Come in, Jackson. Close the door." Jackson took the remaining chair, his posture reflecting the disciplined attention of a professional soldier awaiting assignment details. Morrison had worked with him for 4 years and had never questioned his competence or dedication. This conversation would be one of the most difficult he had ever had with a subordinate. "I'm sure you've reviewed the mission parameters," Morrison began. "Long-range precision shot in challenging conditions with minimal margin for error." "Yes, sir. I've been studying the reconnaissance data and running ballistic calculations. It's definitely within my capabilities, though the wind conditions will require careful timing." Morrison exchanged a glance with Torres before continuing. "Jackson, I want you to understand that what I'm about to say reflects operational requirements, not any assessment of your abilities or value to this team." Jackson's expression didn't change, but Morrison caught the slight tightening around his eyes that indicated he sensed where this conversation was heading. "Based on demonstrated capabilities and specific skill sets, I'm assigning Chen to the overwatch position for this mission." The silence that followed stretched for nearly 30 seconds. Jackson's professional composure remained intact, but Morrison could see him processing the implications of being passed over for a mission that normally would have been his automatic assignment. "Sir," Jackson said finally, "may I ask what factors influenced this decision?" Morrison had been dreading this question. knowing that any honest answer would require acknowledging how thoroughly his previous assessments had been proven wrong. Primary factor is mission success probability. Based on recent demonstrations, Chen has shown precision shooting capabilities that exceed standard requirements for this type of engagement. Jackson nodded slowly. The demonstration on Tuesday. 14 for 14 on the advanced course, and that's correct. Additionally, her deployment experience includes successful long-range engagements under similar conditions. Torres leaned forward slightly. Jackson, this isn't about replacement or demotion. It's about matching specific capabilities to specific mission requirements. I understand, sir. Jackson's response was professionally appropriate, but Morrison detected undertones of disappointment that were entirely natural given the circumstances. Morrison studied Jackson's face, recognizing the internal struggle between personal pride and professional acceptance. Jackson, I want your honest assessment of this decision. Jackson considered the question for a long moment before responding. Sir, if Chen can consistently perform at the level we saw Tuesday, then assigning her to this mission is the right call. My personal feelings don't change operational mathematics. The mature professionalism of Jackson's response reinforced Morrison's confidence in his team's character, even as it highlighted how difficult this transition would be for everyone involved. There's another factor, Morrison added. This mission may require split-second target identification in a complex environment. Chen's deployment record includes similar scenarios with successful outcomes. Torres pulled up additional mission details on his tablet. The target operates with multiple bodyguards and frequently uses human shields. The engagement window may be extremely narrow, requiring someone who can transition quickly between potential targets. Jackson studied the information, his expression becoming more thoughtful than disappointed. Multiple potential targets with civilian considerations. That does change the skill requirements significantly. Morrison felt some of the tension leave the conversation as Jackson began analyzing the mission from a tactical perspective rather than a personal one. This was exactly the kind of professional adaptation that made his team effective in challenging situations. I want you as primary spotter for this mission, Morrison continued. Your technical knowledge and experience reading environmental conditions will be crucial for long-range success. Jackson's expression brightened slightly. Being assigned as spotter wasn't a consolation prize. It was recognition that successful long-range shooting required teamwork between equally skilled professionals. That makes sense, sir. I can handle wind calls and target verification while Chen focuses on shot execution. Torres smiled, recognizing that they had successfully navigated what could have been a divisive personnel decision. Actually, Jackson, there's something else. Chen specifically requested you as her spotter when she learned about the mission parameters. Morrison looked surprised. She requested Jackson? Said his technical expertise and experience would give her the best chance of mission success. Apparently, she's been studying our personnel files and identified Jackson as the optimal partner for this type of engagement. Jackson looked genuinely surprised by this information. She requested me specifically? Her exact words were that Jackson's reputation for precision and technical knowledge made him the logical choice for a mission requiring split-second accuracy. Morrison realized that Sarah's request revealed something important about her character and tactical thinking. Rather than viewing other team members as competition or obstacles, she was actively seeking to leverage their expertise for mission success. The conversation continued for another 15 minutes, covering mission details and preparation timelines. By the time Jackson left the office, the initial tension had been replaced by professional focus on operational requirements. Torres remained behind after Jackson departed. That went better than I expected. Morrison nodded, but his mind was already moving toward broader implications. Torres, what we're seeing here isn't just about one mission or one person. We may need to fundamentally reconsider how we evaluate and assign personnel. You mean moving beyond traditional assumptions about capability and performance? Exactly. If our assessment methods are missing people with Chen's capabilities, what other talent are we overlooking? Torres leaned back in his chair, considering the broader implications. It's going to require changing some deeply ingrained thinking patterns. Sir? Morrison looked out his window again, watching Sarah conduct training exercises with the same methodical precision she had displayed during her demonstration. 3 days had passed since she had shattered his preconceptions, and he was still discovering new ways that those assumptions had been limiting his effectiveness as a leader. "Maybe that's exactly what we need," he said finally. The Yemen mission launched 6 days later under cover of darkness. Morrison monitored the operation from the Tactical Operations Center, surrounded by communication equipment and real-time intelligence feeds. Multiple screens displayed drone footage, satellite imagery, and direct feeds from the team's helmet cameras as they moved into position. Sarah and Jackson had established their overwatch position on a rocky ridgeline overlooking the target compound just before dawn. The 6-hour approach through mountainous terrain had been executed flawlessly, with the sniper team reaching their designated coordinates without detection. Through their transmitted video feed, Morrison could see the compound layout exactly as described in the intelligence briefings. "Overwatch team in position," Jackson's voice crackled through the communication system. "Clear sight lines to primary target building. Winds variable from southeast at 8 to 12 knots. Morrison studied the drone footage showing the compound's activity patterns. The target had maintained consistent routines over the past week, appearing on a second-floor balcony each morning around 800 hours to conduct business meetings with various associates. Intelligence indicated that today's meeting would involve negotiating the sale of advanced explosive devices to terrorist cells operating throughout the region. Target typically appears on the balcony for 12 to 15 minutes. Torres reported from his position at the intelligence station, usually accompanied by 2 or 3 bodyguards who maintain defensive positions. Sarah's voice came through the communications with calm professionalism. "Copy. I have clear sight picture of the target area. Range to balcony is 647 meters. Calculating environmental compensations now." Morrison watched through the sniper team's scope feed as Sarah made minute adjustments to her equipment. The view showed a detailed image of the compound's balcony area, with measurement indicators displaying precise range and wind calculations overlaid on the display. Jackson's technical expertise proved invaluable as he provided continuous environmental updates. "Wind shift to southeast at 10 knots steady. Temperature rising, expect thermal effects to increase in next 30 minutes. "Confirmed," Sarah responded, adjusting for thermal variance and wind drift. The intelligence team reported increased activity within the compound as vehicles arrived carrying the target's business associates. Morrison could see multiple figures moving through the building's interior, preparing for the morning meeting that intelligence had predicted. At 07:55 hours, figures began appearing on the target balcony. Through the high-powered optics, Morrison could clearly see 3 men in traditional dress examining documents and engaging in animated conversation. The target himself was not yet visible. "Multiple personnel on balcony," Jackson reported. "Primary target not yet in sight." Sarah's voice remained steady despite the building tension. "Confirmed. Maintaining sight picture and tracking movement patterns." At 08:02 hours, the target finally appeared. Intelligence had provided detailed photographs for identification, and Morrison could see through the scope feed that the man now standing on the balcony matched all provided descriptors. He was examining a metal case that presumably contained samples of the explosive devices he was negotiating to sell. "Positive identification," Jackson announced. "Primary target confirmed on balcony, northwest corner." Morrison leaned forward, knowing that the next few minutes would determine the mission's success. The target was clearly visible, but he was surrounded by associates and bodyguards who continuously moved around the balcony area. Sarah would need to wait for a clear shot that minimized risk to non-combatants. "I have clear sight picture," Sarah reported. "Target is stationary, examining contents of case. Bodyguards at southeast and northeast positions, not blocking shot angle. Wind steady at southeast 9 knots, Jackson added. Thermal effects minimal. Green light on environmental conditions." Morrison studied the scene through multiple camera angles. The target remained focused on the case contents, providing a stable target for several seconds. The timing was optimal. With clear sight lines and stable environmental conditions, "You are cleared to engage," Morrison transmitted to the sniper team. Through the scope feed, Morrison watched Sarah's crosshairs settle on the target's center mass. The image remained perfectly steady despite the 647-meter range and challenging shooting position. Her breathing had slowed to the controlled rhythm that preceded precision shots. The rifle crack was barely audible through the communication system, but its effects were immediately visible. The target collapsed instantly, the case of explosive devices scattering across the balcony floor. The bodyguards reacted with trained efficiency, but their defensive measures were focused on threats from ground level rather than long-range precision fire. Target down, Jackson confirmed. Clean hit. No civilian casualties. Morrison felt a surge of professional satisfaction as he watched the compound's occupants scramble in confusion. The precision of Sarah's shot had eliminated a significant terrorist asset while avoiding collateral damage that could have complicated regional diplomatic relationships. Outstanding work. Morrison transmitted to the sniper team. Begin extraction procedures immediately. The withdrawal from the ridgeline position occurred as smoothly as the initial approach. Sarah and Jackson moved through predetermined routes that avoided detection, while extraction helicopters maneuvered toward pickup coordinates. The entire operation from target engagement to team recovery took less than 4 hours. During the flight back to base, Morrison reflected on how the mission had validated his decision to assign Sarah to the overwatch position. Her shot had been executed with exactly the kind of precision that the mission required, eliminating the target without endangering innocent personnel or compromising operational security. More importantly, the successful partnership between Sarah and Jackson demonstrated that effective teams could be formed based on complementary skills rather than traditional assumptions about compatibility. Jackson's technical expertise had provided exactly the environmental analysis that Sarah needed, while her shooting capabilities had delivered the precise engagement that the mission demanded. When the team returned to base 6 hours later, Morrison was waiting at the helicopter landing pad. The successful completion of a high-stakes mission always brought a sense of relief, but this operation carried additional significance given the personnel decisions that had preceded it. Sarah emerged from the helicopter carrying her rifle case with the same professional demeanor she had displayed throughout her evaluation process. No celebration, no acknowledgement of having proven herself under the most demanding circumstances possible. Just quiet competence and focus on post-mission procedures. Jackson appeared equally professional, but Morrison caught him nodding respectfully towards Sarah as they walked toward the debriefing facility. The gesture spoke volumes about how their working relationship had developed during the mission. How did the partnership work out? Morrison asked Jackson during the initial debriefing. Flawlessly, sir. Chen's technical knowledge is as impressive as her shooting. She was calculating environmental factors I hadn't even considered. Sarah's mission report was characteristically thorough and precise, documenting every aspect of the engagement from initial setup through target elimination. Her description of the shot itself was matter-of-fact and professional, focusing on technical details rather than personal achievement. Later that evening, Morrison found himself in his office reviewing the mission footage and considering how fundamentally his perspective had changed over the past 10 days. The woman he had initially dismissed as inadequately prepared for special operations pressure had just executed a flawless precision shot under combat, conditions that validated everything she had demonstrated during her evaluation. Torres knocked on his doorframe, carrying 2 cups of coffee and wearing the satisfied expression of someone whose tactical recommendations had proven successful. Hell of a shot, Torres said, settling into his usual chair. Morrison accepted the coffee and nodded. Hell of a shot. Hell of a sniper. You know what this means, right? We're going to have to completely revise our assessment protocols for specialty positions. Morrison looked out his window toward the training ranges where tomorrow's evaluations would take place. Maybe that's not such a bad thing. If our current methods miss someone with Chen's capabilities, what else are we missing? Torres smiled. Change is hard, sir, but sometimes it leads to better outcomes. Morrison thought about Sarah's 14 consecutive hits on the precision course, followed by a flawless combat engagement under the most demanding conditions his unit faced. The evidence was overwhelming that his initial assumptions had been not just wrong, but dangerously limiting. Sometimes, he agreed, change leads to exactly the outcomes we need. Outside his window, the Nevada desert stretched toward distant mountains, looking exactly as it had 2 weeks earlier. But Morrison knew that everything important had changed completely, and his team was stronger because of it.